Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham. As of June of this year, California home prices are double the median price of homes across the United States. Additionally, it is twice as expensive to buy a two-bedroom house here than it is to rent one, and it is estimated that the median household income that you need to afford a two-bedroom house is $238,000 per year. Now, it is no surprise with numbers like that California has some of the lowest home ownership rates across the entire country. But as with all things, this problem is not inevitable. The housing and affordability crisis in our state are a direct result of policy. So today, I want to look at a few of these policies. I want to look at a few past policies that went into effect this year, as well as policies that are up for being approved or vetoed by our governor at the end of October. But before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you stay up to date on all things California politics. Also, if you want more information or sources cited in compiling today's episode, then you should check out my corresponding article on my website, which is linked below. And before we dive into this topic, let me just tell you about today's sponsor, Connected Care. Connected Care is an online mental health therapy platform that seeks to do exactly what its name says, connect patients with providers when it comes to that mental health care that is needed. So if you are a patient, they have so many providers that are ready to help you with whatever phase of life that you're in, and you can check it out from the comfort of your own home at connectedcareinc.com. And if you're a provider, then Connected Care also has your back. They help take on the heavy lifting of things like insurance, billing, credentialing, all the things that you don't want to do when you're just trying to connect with your patients and help them with whatever they are walking through in life. So go to connectedcareinc.com today to get started, because no one should have to navigate mental health care alone. And thanks to Connected Care, you don't have to. All right, so it is mid-September, and what that means is that we're rounding out the corner on the end of our legislative year. So September 13th was the deadline for the California Legislature to actually pass any bills that it had pending to then go to the governor's desk. And now Gavin Newsom has until October 12th to sign or veto the bills that are presented in front of him. So I thought this was a very opportune time to do a little bit of a policy update, look at some of the legislation that was enacted that went into effect this year and how it has affected us in our state, as well as looking at legislation that is up for being passed this year that could go into effect next year to affect your life. And I was seeing a lot of different bills, both past and present, specifically on housing. So that is what we are diving into today. So with that, let's start with SB 1211. This is a bill that was passed last year. It went into effect as of January 1st of this past year, and we are starting to see a lot of the repercussions of what this bill is actually doing in communities. So originally, SB 1211 was marketed as housing and parking reform. So just to back up, we've talked before on the show about CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. CEQA was passed back, I think, in the 1980s or 1970s by Ronald Reagan when he was governor of California. And it really imposes a lot of strict regulations on developers who are trying to build housing here in California. It's the number one thing that conservative advocates like myself say needs reform in order to help our housing and affordability crises in the state. However, with that, it's very complicated and there's a lot of different requirements. So one certain requirement had to do with parking. So when developers are starting to build out new housing, there are requirements on the amount of parking that they have to have in those complexes and that need to be offered to tenants. In an effort to reform that part of CEQA, SB 1211 reduced the parking requirements specifically for developments that are built in areas that are near public transportation or other transit options. So this was trying to kill two birds with one stone. It reforms a part of CEQA, but it mostly was a green initiative to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by pushing people into housing that is right near public transportation. And so in theory, it should help to reduce the amount of cars that people are driving to and from the various places that they are going. Now, in practice, what has this done? Well, in practice, it hasn't really stuck to just new developments. It hasn't only been a way to incentivize developers to build developments near public transportation and then be able to build more and more units because they have less parking requirements. In reality, it has actually affected tenants who have already existing housing and who were guaranteed parking as part of their lease agreements. And so this is coming up because in Koreatown here in LA, tenants were speaking out and trying to protest the fact that their landlord was taking the parking spaces that they were guaranteed and that they had for years and switching them, turning them into ADUs because under this bill, he was within the right amount of distance from the transit stations to be able to do that. So you might be thinking, well, regardless of tenants having their parking taken away, isn't this a good thing? Because it's reforming part of CEQA, which we're always calling to reform, and it's also making it easier for developers to build more housing in theory, right? Because there's less regulatory burden on them. Well, I would say to that it is really important for us with all policies in every topic to always look at the long run. What's the long run solution that we're going for with housing? What we're trying to do with housing is to reduce the roadblocks for developers to be able to build in California so that we have higher supply. Is SB 1211 actually doing that? Is it making it easier for developers across the state to build housing and to get people in units to create that supply so that the demand is more equal with it and that prices go down? I would argue it's not really doing that. When you look at an issue like parking, or you look at an issue like people driving isn't always a linear one-to-one. Just because I live near public transportation, it means that I don't have a car, or it means that I don't drive in. Especially in a place like California, we don't really have the public transportation infrastructure as maybe other states like New York or just other places do. And on top of that California has massive issues with crime, with general decline of our cities, with homelessness. And so it makes it feel really unsafe for people to even use things like public transportation, especially in the heart of downtown of big cities like Los Angeles. And as I was thinking about this, I was kind of thinking in my head, it's almost as if we said, okay, housing developers, we know that in every unit you have to have a bathroom and that can be a lot of work and that can be increased cost. It takes up space. And so just don't put bathrooms in your units and then we'll get people in these housing units and boom, we have affordable housing. We've solved the supply issue. That would be ridiculous. We would say you can't cut down on the required amenities that are part of living in a living space. And for many people, that's what parking feels like, right? You have a car, you need somewhere to park it. You're not just going to be forced into an entirely different lifestyle, like relying heavily on biking, walking, public transport, just because you live maybe in proximity to it. And so you're taking away amenities. You might get a handful of ADUs as a result of that. But again, we're not hitting at those root causes. And so this is just one example to me of why seemingly boring and somewhat niche housing laws are really important for us to pay attention to, because legislation stacks on top of each other. So you could have this bill that talks about the parking requirements and creates a loophole, and then you can have another bill that talks about something else, and suddenly we have all of these different legislative requirements on developers or even affecting tenants. And that's what creates the ecosystem that we operate in when it comes to the housing situation in California. So it's important to realize what we are actually doing when we're passing laws, what requirements we're creating, and what costs or burdens are associated with them. And SB 1211 is not the only example of this. So I want to move to another law that was just signed this summer, and that is AB 130. Now, this ties back into the vehicle sort of issue. It seems that in California, your housing is really tied into your car and the amount of miles that you drive, which just doesn't seem like it should be correlated to me, but regardless, that is the situation here. And so what AB 130 did is it actually had a provision in it. It wasn't the entire bill, but it had a provision in the bill about vehicle miles traveled and about the fees associated with that. So let me explain. In housing, there's something called VMT mitigation fees. VMT is what I just said, vehicle miles traveled. Basically, the state of California sees any new housing development as creating new opportunities or new needs for people to be driving cars. And so in a state where there is a huge policy priority on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, lawmakers want to reduce the amount that people need to drive around the state. In order to do that, they actually impose a fee on developments that are placed outside of transit centers and urban hubs. So the further that your housing development is being built from a bus station or a train station, the higher the VMT mitigation fee is going to be on that development. So developers have to pay those fees, and those things actually should go directly toward funding a lot of those projects, like increasing public transportation or paving more bike paths. Interesting note on that, it actually has been found that VMTs also go toward affordable housing projects. Not entirely sure how that is mitigating people driving, but regardless, that in theory is what the VMT impact fees are supposed to be about. Here's the problem. When you add fees like a VMT fee on top of developments, you drive up the cost of that housing, because any costs that get put on the developer, on the person building the property, eventually are going to get passed down to the person buying or renting that property. It's just basic economics. So now you have two competing priorities. We have the priority in our state about greenhouse gas emissions and reducing those. And we also have the priority of making housing more affordable. And the way to do that is to reduce the fees. It's to reduce the regulations. It's to make sure that developers can afford to build housing here and that they can recoup their costs when they go on and sell those developments. But by California passing more laws that just impose more fees, it's just going to continue creating the problem. So now take that in conjunction with SB 1211, which says, well, we're trying to reduce regulations. We're trying to take away these parking requirements. And it's like, maybe you'll get some more ADUs out of that, or you can pack more units into a place because you don't have to have as many parking spaces. But then you're also piling on these VMT fees at the same time. And so it's just insane. The bills just clash with each other. And at the end of the day, it's not solving anything. Housing policy matters because every bill introduced in our state and passed through our legislature will include more requirements and will have hidden costs. All of these housing reforms actually have hidden costs to the home buyer, to the renter, to the tenant. And so we need to be honest and transparent and evaluate every policy that's being passed in our state for how they are going to layer on top of each other to actually affect people who are trying to live here and afford living here. So clearly, these laws need a lot of clarity brought to them. We need to understand how they all work together. And while that can be very challenging to do because there are literally hundreds of laws and they all intertwine, the good news is that you can bring clarity to your skin with Amallow's tallow products. I love Amallow. I use them every single night. I use their whipped tallow. And let me tell you, it has made my skin so much softer, so much more moisturized, and it just smells good and feels like I'm really pampering myself. So we hear so much today, especially with personal care products, that there are just so many toxins in them, or there are things like endocrine disruptors, or it's not natural to our skin. And the good news about tallow products is it's one of the most natural things that you can get. Amallow uses grass-fed, grass-finished beef to create their tallow, so it's really high quality. And then any of the scents that they're adding to it are made with organic essential oils, so you're not working with endocrine disruptors. And because tallow is so natural, it is actually biocompatible with human skin. And so that means it is going to work to moisturize without clogging pores, so you don't have to worry about breakouts or acne. And it's also going to lock in that moisture to help dry or damaged or even sensitive skin. So I think that you should check them out. They are, like I said, incredible. I love using them. And they have so many amazing scents. I use their vanilla latte scent, and it really smells like a vanilla latte, and I can use it guilt-free because I know that it's not using any sort of fake scent out there or anything that is going to mess with my hormones, but it's just using organic essential oils. So I feel really great about using it. So if you're ready for a natural, healthy, and beautiful glow, then you should go to amallow.com/TessAbraham or click the link below to get 15% off your order. These are products for both men and women. My husband also uses tallow every night. He uses a different scent than I do, but he loves it on his skin as well. And they also have so many more products. They have clean perfume, they have lip gloss, and they even came out with a new tallow sun balm that I am dying to try. I'm sure it's amazing. So go check them out. Use my link. That's amallow.com/TessAbraham to get 15% off your order and to support the show. But getting back to the lack of clarity in California's housing laws, there is one more bill that I want to look at, and it is a bill that has not yet passed, and that is SB 79. So SB 79 has actually passed through the legislature, but it is being brought before Governor Newsom. And like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, he has until October 12th to either sign it or to veto it. What SB 79 really highlights is another hidden cost. So it's not just the cost that we have talked about with the other two bills, but there is a new cost that we need to look at. And that cost is the cost of the loss of local control, specifically when it comes to housing decisions like zoning. What this bill does is it is actually a state-imposed density effort. And what it's saying is it is allowing for taller buildings to be able to be built in zones where in the past they would not have been allowed. Think single family zones. So single family home zones wouldn't have allowed such tall apartment buildings. Single family zones are specifically for one family to live in each building. But obviously a place that is 6 stories is multi-family units. So it's basically destroying single family zoning across our state. And it's doing it, again, not on a local level where local governments have a say in the zoning around their cities, which is normally how it would happen. And I would argue is the better way to do it, but it's just saying on a California-wide level. And so it's being reported that this bill has been fiercely opposed by neighborhood preservation groups, critics of market rate development, and a long list of local governments, LA included, interestingly enough, who argue that the bill tramples on local prerogatives over what gets built and where. So the crux of this issue, like I just said, is the zoning. And zoning is usually a local decision. So city planners are able to look at the character of the neighborhoods around their cities. They're able to look at the more urban areas where more people want to live, maybe right next to the heart of the city versus more of the suburb areas. And they're able to zone out what type of buildings are allowed to be developed where. Former city planner John Terrell, who's also part of Neighbors for a Better California, described the opposition when he said, quote, "Local government is closest to the people and is best able to judge where and where not to do certain types of development." And I think that that is just so true. Like with anything, we want to try to keep the power and the voice and the say with the people. And so we love to do that on a state level. We don't want a massive federal government. And we also love to do that on a local level. We don't want a massive state government. And so just enacting a sweeping, broad ability for these massive multi-family units to be built in any zone essentially wipes out the zoning rights of city planners who, again, know their communities, know their land, know their people best. And why is this bad? Think of what placing a massive apartment building right in the heart of a place that's a suburb and has single family homes would do. It's going to increase traffic. It's going to be more congested because there's just going to be more people living there. There is going to be a need for more parking. And if it is located in a place that doesn't need to have ample parking for every resident, now you're going to have a lot more people parked on your streets. So it's lots of considerations like that, that's what city planners take into account when they're actually looking at a city and when they're actually zoning out where certain types of housing and projects can be developed. So, what have we learned today from these different bills and this little policy update that we've done on housing legislation in our state? The first thing that I think we need to take away is that not every single bill that's labeled as housing reform is real reform. And that's exactly what we saw with SB 1211. It says that it's reforming CEQA and it's reforming the housing regulations, but we see that it's not really hitting at the key bottlenecks that come up or the barriers to entry that developers have to go through. It's just tweaking a minor part of it that's actually hurting tenants more than it is helping them. Second, we see that hidden costs pile up, and we saw that with AB 130. That wasn't the entirety of the bill, but it included a provision to increase these VMT fees depending on where the development is being built in California. And that's really concerning. We don't want to be passing down hidden costs to homebuyers, especially when we are championing the idea that we're supposed to be making housing more affordable across the state. And third, we see that our state is reaching for more control rather than reaching for solutions. And we see that in SB 79 because we see that it's actually just trying to mandate things as a statewide level rather than working with local communities and local governments to figure out what the specific needs of the community are and why housing has maybe been stalled or why development hasn't been moving forward in their cities. And so the biggest problem is that California continues to layer on regulations without addressing the root cause of the housing crisis across our state, namely overregulation, endless CEQA delays, sky-high fees, which are not made better by these bills that impose more fees, and a hostile building environment. Until our legislature is ready to actually tackle those root cause issues, then no amount of creative solutions that target little bits and pieces here and there will actually solve the housing crisis. And so, my friends, this is why it is so important for us to pay attention to policy and specifically housing policy, because each bill that is passed through the legislature and approved by our governor has the power to shape our communities, steer what the cost of living will be, and have an impact on the future of California. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope it was helpful for you as you navigate life in our state and that you even learned something new. Please spread the word and share this show with your friends, family, and fellow Californians. And I'll see you back here next week for another episode of the California Conversation.